In 1892, a Rhode Island family cut a dead girl's heart from her chest because they believed she was stealing her own brother's life from the grave. That girl was Mercy Brown, and the thing killing her family was not a vampire at all. It was tuberculosis, the disease people once called consumption. Across New England, mothers, sons, and daughters died one after another, and each new cough, each drop of blood, and each funeral made the old vampire stories feel real. Then people opened graves and found swollen bodies, red fluid at the mouth, and teeth that looked longer than before, and that looked like evidence. This story follows 3 clues: a disease that spread through families, corpses that seemed too alive, and one famous case that ended with ashes in a cup. By the end, you will see why frightened towns thought they had proof, why the ritual cure failed, and why the real monster never needed a coffin. The first hard truth is that vampire folklore already existed long before Mercy Brown died in 1892 and long before rural New England became scared of its own graves. People in Europe had already told stories about restless dead, revenants, and bodies that returned to trouble the living, especially in villages that feared bad deaths. So tuberculosis did not invent the vampire by itself. Tuberculosis gave old stories a new body, a new pattern, and a new kind of evidence. When one child died, then a sister grew pale, then a brother started coughing blood. The old folklore stopped sounding like a tale and started sounding like diagnosis. The dead relative was no longer just remembered. In the minds of grieving families, the dead relative became the hidden hand reaching back into the house. That matters because the people in these stories were not chasing random shadows. They were trying to explain a pattern that looked personal, direct, and cruel. Tuberculosis was a bacterial disease, but most families in the 18th and 19th centuries did not know that a germ was moving from body to body. They knew the older name, consumption, and that word alone shaped the fear, because it sounded like something inside the victim was being slowly consumed. A person with consumption often coughed for months, ran fevers at night, sweated through the bed, lost strength, lost weight, and sometimes coughed up blood. The illness could move slowly through one house for months or even years, because close family members shared rooms, air, blankets, and long daily contact. Modern medicine explains that pattern with infection, prolonged exposure, and different immune responses, but older communities saw the same pattern and read intention into it. One person died in winter, another weakened in spring, and a third began fading in summer, and that sequence looked like someone was choosing victims. If a dead mother was buried first and her daughter fell sick next, neighbors could imagine that the mother was calling the daughter into the earth. If a dead son was buried and his brother started spitting blood weeks later, the grave looked less like an ending and more like an active threat. Tuberculosis also changed the face and body in ways that matched older vampire ideas almost perfectly. Pale skin, hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, and a mouth stained red. By the final stage, the living victim often looked drained, almost emptied out, as if blood, breath, and strength were being pulled away by something unseen. That visual language mattered in a world without x-rays, antibiotics, or a trusted map of how germs worked, because people judged disease with their own eyes. And what their eyes saw was a family member shrinking in bed, while a corpse in the grave sometimes seemed fuller, redder, and less ruined than expected. Before antibiotics, whole rooms became danger zones because families shared cough-filled air through long winters with windows shut against New England cold. Latency made the pattern worse because one family member could seem healthy for months before showing the same fever, cough, and weight loss. Consumption also struck many young adults, which made the disease feel even more unnatural because strong sons and daughters faded during the years they should have looked healthiest. In small farming towns, the same churchyard, the same kin network, and the same house made every new illness feel tied to the last burial. The fear did not stop with the body. Sick people often said the dead were visiting them at night, pressing on the chest, or calling them towards sleep. Today, fever, grief, low oxygen, exhaustion, and sleep paralysis give us better ways to explain those night terrors, but those explanations were not available in 1793 or 1892. A person with damaged lungs can feel crushing pressure in the dark, especially when breathing becomes hard and every breath sounds wet and thin. A grieving daughter can dream of a mother buried only weeks before, and a whole household can hear that dream and treat it like a warning. Once the house was already filled with funerals, coughing, and dread, even a nightmare could become another piece of the case against the dead. So the vampire was not only a body below the ground, it was also an answer for what the sick felt in their own chest at night. The second clue sat inside the grave itself, and it fooled people because normal decomposition can look terrifying when you expect a corpse to stay still and dry. After death, Bacteria inside the body break tissue down and release gases, and those gases can swell the belly, face, and chest. To a grieving father who expected a thin, sunken corpse, that swelling could make the body look well-fed, almost as if it had eaten recently. As pressure builds, reddish-brown fluid can seep from the mouth and nose, and to frightened witnesses that fluid looked like fresh blood from a new feeding. Another cruel trick happens at the skin. It dries, tightens, and pulls back from the nails and gums as the body changes after death. Hair and nails do not truly keep growing in the grave, but shrunken skin can make both look longer, sharper, and stranger than before burial. Teeth can also look more exposed when the lips and gums draw back, and that is how an ordinary corpse can seem to grow fangs. Skin can blister, slip, darken, or peel in patches, and each change looks alarming if no one has studied how dead tissue naturally behaves. Weather changed everything too. A body buried in freezing winter ground could decay far more slowly than a body buried during warmer months. Cold season burials were especially misleading because winter earth worked almost like storage, slowing rot just enough to turn a normal corpse into a frightening exception. A sealed coffin, a cold crypt, dry soil, or the wrong mix of moisture could preserve soft tissue much longer than neighbors expected. Under some wet or cool conditions, body fat can even turn waxy and help hold the shape of the face and limbs. Families also expected the dead to look peaceful and empty. When a coffin instead revealed color, fluid, and fullness, peace turned into accusation within minutes. Some observers even treated intact lungs or a heavy heart as signs of feeding, even though organs can survive longer in cold soil than neighbors expected. None of those changes required magic, but they could make a corpse look strangely intact when the family digging it up expected only bones. That is why the most recently buried person, or the best preserved one, often became the main suspect during New England vampire panics. People did not open graves looking for science in the modern sense. They opened graves looking for an answer to a house full of coughing and funerals. Once the coffin lid came off, every normal sign of decomposition could be read backward, as if decay itself were proof of hidden life. A swollen body became a fed body. Red fluid became stolen blood. Exposed teeth became fangs. Preserved tissue became a sign that the dead refused to rest. This was bad forensic science long before forensic science had rules, textbooks, trained examiners, or common public understanding in rural New England towns. The body gave them evidence, but the evidence only made sense inside a mistaken belief about what disease and death were doing. Tuberculosis made that mistake even stronger because the dying often looked more wasted than the dead. That is the darkest visual trick in the whole story. A person near death from consumption could be little more than bone, fever, and blood on a cloth, while the corpse in winter soil looked fuller. To modernize, the grave held gas, fluid, and delayed decay. To 19th century neighbors, the grave held a body that seemed to have regained strength. The dead could appear more alive than the living person still gasping in bed, and that single contrast pushed fear straight into ritual. Those rituals were especially common in rural New England, in places like Rhode Island, Connecticut, Vermont, and parts of Massachusetts and Maine. Folklore researchers have found roughly 80 reported exhumation cases across the Northeast, with many clustered in rural New England during the 19th century. These were not cape-wearing movie vampires. These were dead relatives blamed for wasting illness inside the same family that had buried them. The usual process was grim and practical. A family exhumed a body, checked for blood or intact organs, and tried to decide which corpse looked least decayed. If the signs looked wrong, people removed the heart, liver, and sometimes the lungs, then burned those organs as a kind of emergency cure. In some cases, ashes from the burned organs were mixed with water or another liquid and given to the sick person to drink. In other cases, bones were rearranged, corpses were turned face down, or smoke from the burning organs became part of the remedy. The ritual sometimes involved smoke as well as ashes, because breathing in the burned remains was imagined as a way to break the dead person's grip. This was folk medicine, fear, and grief acting together because doing something terrible felt better than waiting helplessly for another funeral in the same house. No American case shows that pattern more clearly than Mercy Lena Brown of Exeter, Rhode Island, in the bitter winter of 1892. Mercy was born in 1872, and family and friends reportedly called her Lena, a small detail that makes the story feel painfully human. Exeter was rural, thinly populated, and already marked by hardship, migration, poverty, farm struggle, and years of tuberculosis cutting through local homes. The Brown family had been hit again and again by consumption, Mercy's mother, Mary Eliza Brown, died of the disease in December 1883. Mercy's sister, Mary Olive Brown, died only months later, in June 1884, and the disease still had not finished with the house. Years passed, but the pattern returned when Mercy's brother, Edwin Brown, developed the same wasting illness that had already taken 2 women in the family. Mercy then fell sick herself with what people described as a fast-moving, galloping form of tuberculosis, and she died on January 17, 1892. Edwin's condition kept getting worse, and like many tuberculosis patients in the 19th century, he went west for dry air and rest. He spent time in places including Colorado Springs, because fresh air and climate therapy were among the few things doctors could still recommend. Edwin improved somewhat away from home, but after he returned to Exeter, his health fell again, and fear inside the town deepened. Edwin's trip west shows the medical limits of the time. Doctors could suggest climate, rest, and fresh air, but they could not kill the bacteria. Neighbors and townspeople began pressing the Brown family to exhume their dead and find out which buried relative was feeding on Edwin. The logic was brutal but simple. The corpse that looked least decayed must be the one still taking life from the living. On March 17, 1892, the bodies of Mercy, her mother Mary Eliza, and her sister Mary Olive were dug up for inspection. The older bodies had been buried much longer, so they had decomposed heavily and were largely skeletal when neighbors and relatives examined them. Mercy had been dead for only about 2 months, and winter conditions had preserved her far better than the other 2 women. Her body reportedly still had relatively intact organs, and several frightened observers standing there believed there was blood in the heart area. To a modern forensic pathologist, that is not shocking in a recently buried body preserved by cold weather, coffin conditions, and normal postmortem change. To the people standing around that coffin in Exeter, Rhode Island, those same details looked like a verdict delivered by the corpse itself. Mercy was declared the vampire, even though the only thing special about her body was that she had died later and decayed more slowly. Her heart and liver were removed and burned, and the ashes were reportedly mixed into a bitter tonic for Edwin Brown to drink. The remedy failed completely. Edwin Brown died on May 10, 1892, only weeks after the graveyard ritual that was meant to save him. The saddest detail is that more Brown siblings later died of consumption too, which proves the killer never sat in Mercy's coffin. What made Mercy's case famous was not only the exhumation. It happened in the newspaper age, when a local tragedy could spread far beyond Exeter. It also happened 10 years after Koch found the tuberculosis bacillus, which shows how slowly scientific knowledge traveled from laboratories into frightened rural homes. Mercy Brown became famous because newspapers widely covered the case, but the same deadly pattern had appeared in New England much earlier. A Connecticut newspaper in 1784 described a belief that repeated deaths from consumption could be stopped by exhuming the dead and burning remains. In that report, people even looked for a strange sprout or vine supposedly growing from the body. Another sign read through folklore instead of medicine. Physicians who attended that exhumation found no supernatural proof, yet the grave was still opened because the family needed an answer fast. Later accounts from Vermont describe a 1793 case in Manchester where a dead woman's heart, liver, and lungs were burned on a blacksmith's forge. That blacksmith's forge matters because it shows how public these acts could be. This was not castle horror. This was community work with local tools. By 1854, newspapers described more exhumations in places like Jewett City, Connecticut, showing that the fear kept moving across towns and decades. In 1859, Henry David Thoreau wrote about a Vermont family that burned the lungs, heart, and liver of the last deceased to stop consumption. Thoreau's short note matters because it proves educated Americans in 1859 already knew these anti-vampire rituals were still happening in rural New England towns. So Mercy Brown was never a lone oddity. She was the best-known face of a longer regional panic built by disease, burial, and desperate hope. Archaeology later showed that these stories were not just rumors repeated in old newspapers, because real graves in Connecticut carried the marks of anti-vampire fear. In the early 1990s, a burial found in Griswold, Connecticut, revealed a man's skull and thigh bones arranged over his chest like a skull and crossbones. Researchers called the burial JB55 because brass tacks on the coffin marked initials and age, turning a feared corpse into a traceable human being. A 1994 anthropological study argued that the burial fit New England vampire belief, especially because the skeleton showed rib damage linked to chronic lung disease. That lung disease was likely tuberculosis or something very close to it, which matches the same wasting pattern seen in the Mercy Brown story. Later DNA and genealogy work identified JB55 as John Barber, a real working-class Connecticut man who likely died in the 1830s. His bones were rearranged after decomposition as an anti-vampire measure, meaning a real community physically altered a real body because illness frightened them. The Connecticut vampire shows that the folklore left marks in the ground, not just words on paper or whispers in surviving families. New England did not invent this fear from nothing. Europe had already seen famous vampire scares, especially in the Balkans and Habsburg lands. In 1725, villagers blamed Petar Blagojevic in Serbia for a cluster of deaths, and officials exhumed his body under Habsburg imperial authority. Witnesses said the corpse looked well preserved, with apparent blood at the mouth, and staking the body supposedly made more blood flow. Modern readers can match those details with ordinary decomposition, but people in 1725 Serbia still treated them as official proof of vampirism. Another major case centered on Arnold Paul in 17, and military surgeons helped examine several bodies linked to that panic. Reports from those Serbian cases traveled through clerks, officials, priests, and scholars, slowly turning local village fear into a larger European debate. By the time those reports crossed the Atlantic, vampire stories had already entered official papers, learned argument, printed discussion, and public imagination. Those European stories matter because they carried vampire language across oceans, so later New England families already had an old script for new suffering. Tuberculosis best explains the American family cases, while some Balkan panics may have mixed decomposition fear with other epidemics, burial customs, or even rabies theories. Some later writers tried to blame vampire legend on porphyria, but that explanation fits the New England cases far worse than tuberculosis does. Rabies has also been proposed for parts of European lore, especially where biting and aggression mattered, yet it does not match Mercy Brown or Edwin Brown well. The family pattern, the wasting body, the coughing blood, and the grave rituals all point back most strongly to consumption spreading through close contact. It is easy to laugh from a distance, but the people who dug up these graves were not fools. They were working with terrifying evidence and no cure. Robert Koch identified the tuberculosis bacterium in 1882, yet Mercy Brown was exhumed in 1892, a full decade after science had found the cause. That gap between discovery and everyday life is one of the darkest parts of the story, because knowledge existed in the world and still arrived too late. That failure matters because once medicine offered no reliable cure, a graveyard ritual could seem no less useful than any other desperate attempt. So the real horror was never an undead creature climbing from a coffin. It was a bacterium moving through one family after another while grief gave it a face. If you want more true stories where history built the monster, subscribe to 11 Demon, because the next legend looks supernatural until the evidence turns human.